So I've been spending the past probably month self-drafting this cable knit vest here, and it's not done yet, but it's pretty darn close and it's looking really good. So I figured this was a good time for us to sit down and I'm going to show you my entire self-drafting process start to finish. I've been knitting my own clothes for like a year and a half now, and the first garment that I ever self-drafted was after about 2 months. It was maybe my third or fourth sweater ever, and it's one of my favorites to this day because I was able to decide the stitch pattern, the shaping, the sizing, everything that I wanted. And just a few general tips to keep in mind to keep this from getting overwhelming as you go through the process. Number one, block as you go. I'm still not done with this garment here, but I've probably done like a full-on wet blocking of it 2 or 3 times already during the process just to make sure that I was on track with what I wanted. Tip number 2, expect some trial and error. Be prepared to frog things. It's totally fine. It's always worth frogging and going back if you're not happy with something. The way that I think of this is if you think of professional pattern designers, even if they've done everything perfectly and professionally, once they go into the test knitting phase and the sample knitting phase, they're still having to go back and fix things and make alterations based on like the reality of what they're doing. So don't be afraid to frog. And final tip, take notes. You will want notes. You will want to know exactly how you arrived at certain steps so that if you need to redo them, you know what you did the first time. So this is a swatch using fingering weight yarn held with a mohair, and I was trying out a couple of different cable patterns that I might want to do, but in the end I decided that this has like no stitch definition to it. I wanted dark cables, but I did want to be able to see them a little bit. So I decided against this swatch, and the great thing about not working with a pattern is that I could drop the mohair, swatch again, with a fingering weight swatch, and I didn't have to worry that I was off gauge because I am deciding the gauge. So once you've got a gauge swatch where you're happy with the fabric, this is where we're going to want to start taking notes. I've just made note of my chart. If you want to do something stockinette, you're good. Everything is going to be simpler for you and you get to skip this step, but just make a note of a chart that is based on your gauge swatch. Next, you're going to want to calculate your stitch gauge and your row gauge. Be as precise as possible here. And I am doing everything in centimeters. I'm Canadian, but also this is going to make the math a lot easier, so you can definitely do all of this in inches. But if you look here, the very first thing that we're going to do is take this 10 centimeter gauge and divide it by 10. You can divide by 4 if you're doing inches, but what that gives me is 3.5 stitches per centimeter. And go ahead and circle that, highlight it, because we're going to need that number later. And I'm going to do the same thing with the row gauge. So the reason that these two numbers are so important, stitches per centimeter for both the stitches and the rows, is that I now know that if I want to have a garment that's, let's say 50 centimeters across, I can multiply 50 by this number to get the exact stitch count that I need. Okay, this brings us to step number 2. Step number 2 is kind of fun. We want to get a garment that we already have. Ideally, this will be one of your hand knits, but really you're just looking for a garment that's a similar construction to what you want to self-draft and you're happy with the fit. So I'm just grabbing one of my favorite vests here. It's not an identical construction to what I'm self-drafting. This is the all-season vest by Noriko Ishikawa, and don't worry, I will not be giving out pattern details or anything. So this is a slip-over style vest, and it's got a v-neck, but a quite high and curved v-neck, which is not what I'm going for my garment. I'm doing a sort of button-up with a very deep V, so I'm not using it for that. This is a sort of drop shoulder construction, but it's a different construction from what I'm going for. It uses short rows to shape the back, and what I want to do instead is a trapezoid shape where I pick up stitches from there. So I want to use this vest to grab a few measurements. I want to know the general width at the neck because that's how many stitches I will want to cast on before increasing to make my trapezoid shape. I also want to know the width down here without including the ribbing at the armholes because that is the sort of end width of the trapezoid. So increasing from that width to this width. I also want to know the length from the back of the neck down to where we start making increases down here at the arm. So you can take more measurements than that as well. That's kind of the bare minimum that you need in order to get the back panel. But you can also take measurements for, like, for example, the shoulder width, if that's something you're really worried about. Okay, so I've gone ahead and taken note of all of these numbers. I'm now going to draw a probably very ugly trapezoid so that we can take a look at how those numbers relate to the back panel. So what I'm looking to do is cast on a number of stitches there, and that is the number of the neck width. Then I also grabbed the width of the back panels. So that was the width from one armhole to the other, not including the armhole ribbing. So that is the length down here after doing the increases. And then the height value here for me was 20 centimeters before doing increases for the armholes down here. So if I wanted to get like really specific here, I could also grab a height for this little triangle shape here. But really what I want to do is just increase like as fast as possible so that I don't have too much of a slope to my trapezoid. So this is good information for the time being. And what I'm going to do now is pop that out so that I can keep an eye on it. And this is where we actually have to start thinking of our knitting instructions before we cast on. And this is where, in order to get stitch counts based on these distance values, we need those 2 stitches per centimeter numbers there. So for my cast on stitches, 24 centimeters times 3.5 for my stitches per centimeter. So 24 times 3.5 is equal to 84. Now, if you are doing stockinette, you're good. That's the number that you want to cast on, plus maybe an edge stitch at either side. That will help you a lot later when you have to pick up stitches for a sleeve or an armhole. But for me, remember, I have got this cable chart that I'm doing. So my cable chart is a multiple of 7. So that's 5 stitches in the cable plus 2 in between each. So I do need to take an extra second here just to make sure that the stitch count I am casting on has the appropriate number of stitches in order to get full cable repeats when I cast on. So what that means for me is a multiple of 7 plus 2 for the stitches on the other side, and then plus an additional 2 for the 2 edge stitches that I want. And this will mean having to do a little bit of rounding to either side. And I am going to be rounding lower because I actually think that 24 number was a little bit high there. So what I am going with is 63 stitches. Now, after casting on, if you are doing this trapezoid format, you're going to want to increase, for me, as quickly as possible. So what that means is 1 stitch at the end of each row. So basically what that amounts to, and now I'll start showing you this on my work in progress. I think that'll be the easiest way to describe this. So I've just folded over the fronts here so that you can only see the back's trapezoid. So that was casting on X number of stitches and then start knitting in pattern. And in order to get a pretty non-dramatic slant there, what I did was increase at the end of each row. So I would have gone to one end, increase, wrong side, go to the other end, increase. One end, increase, etc. Maybe leave that there so you can get a little visual of that trapezoid shape while we're talking. Okay, so that was increase 1 stitch at the end of every row, but how long do we need to do that for? The answer is going to be from the width of our back panel, so that's the width where we want to stop doing our increases. And again, how many stitches is that going to be? 38 times that 3.5 number is equal to 133. And again, I want to do that extra step to make sure that I'm adjusting that number so that I get a number that my stitch pattern will fit into multiple times. A second way that you can go about this same process is figuring out how wide you want your shoulders to be, and then figure out how many stitches need to be increased based on that. For me, one of the values I grabbed was 10 centimeter shoulders. So that would mean, again, times 3.5, that I would want to add in 35 stitches. Because my cable is a repeat of 7, that is actually perfect. I want to add 5 cables because 5 times 7 is equal to 35. So then once you've increased all of those stitches, you then just want to knit in pattern until you get to that height of your trapezoid value. No math really needed there. The last step that I have put here is block. This is a really good time to take a pause and wet block what you have once you've got that trapezoid, because at this point we do still need to add some stitches for the underarm. So if we need to adjust that, add a few more, add a few less based on how this is blocked, we can still do that. So at this point we've got a blocked trapezoid down to about here. And then we want to continue working in pattern, but doing some increases along here for the underarm. So tiny bit of math for this step as well. What I want to grab is my measurement for the desired total width of my vest. So from here to here, and for me, I believe that was 52. I want to subtract that from the current width of my back panel, which turned out to be about 35. So 52 minus 35, and that is going to give us the amount of width that we still need to add at this next step. But we want to divide that number by 2 because we're evening it out over the left underarm and the right underarm. So that gives us 8.5 centimeters of stitches that need to be added at the underarm here. And again, if you want to know what that is in stitches, you can multiply it by, for me it's 3.5, my stitches per centimeter, and that gives me about 30 stitches. So this is what the end underarm ends up looking like. So this is at the end of the back panel. Keep working in pattern and then adding a stitch at the end of every row. Then the same thing will happen at the front. And you have the option to cast on some stitches when you join the front and the back. If you consider these two together, the front and the back, you actually don't need to do the divide by 2 part, and this would be 60 stitches per underarm. But then you have to decide how you want to divide those 60 stitches over the increases here, the stitches cast on for joining the front and the back, and here. And I believe what I ended up doing was just dividing that by 3, so adding 20 stitches by this method, casting on 20 here, and 20 on the front as well. So what that means for the stage that we were actually at is that in order to finish this back panel, keep going in pattern, adding a stitch at, I said the end of every row because for me, my armholes were getting a little bit deep already. But if you were worried about the depth of your armholes, you could also adjust that rate to be maybe every other row, every 3 rows, etc. So at this point, we've finished our back panel and we are ready to cast on for the fronts. So the first question is how many stitches to pick up here, and I just did the exact number of stitches that I had increased, and for me that was 35. So I picked up 35 stitches. That meant that I was basically symmetrical on either side. I had 5 cables added here, and I started with 5 cables here, plus of course the edge stitches. Now, once you've picked up those stitches, what's the next step? So we've got our trapezoid, we've picked up stitches along here, and we don't want to start increasing for our neck right away, because keep in mind that this is going to sit on your back, so you would be increasing stitches too early. So this is the first point where you actually want to start thinking 3-dimensionally and considering yourself as like a 3D object, because this needs to go basically from the nape of your neck to the front of your neck. And that might involve a little bit of trial and error. This is another place where you could take an existing garment that you have and take a measurement from the cast on edge at the back of the neck to where the increases for a neckline started, whether it was a crew neck or a V-neck, whatever. So you're going to want to knit straight for a little bit for whatever distance you find that to be, and that will give you kind of a little rectangle. And then you want to start your increases for the neckline. And another thing that's worth pointing out here is that the shoulder angle does kind of sort itself out with this construction, at least in my experience. You can see how this is like a good slope for a shoulder, even though the trapezoid here was a little bit more dramatic. So from there, knitting straight for some distance, for me, I think it was about 5 centimeters up to here where I did my first increase. And then the next question is, how deep do you want your neckline to be from the first increase to the very last increase? I wanted a pretty deep one. So what we're planning out here, if we look at our little diagram, is the increases to get a widening shape along here. So in order to get that number, you guessed it, we're going to do another measurement. If you have an existing garment with a neckline that you like the measurement of, that's a really good one. But remember that we're not really working diagonally here. To this point, we've really just been working with widths and lengths. So what you want here is a length value from where your first increase is going to be down to where you want your last increase to be. And my V-neck is so deep that I can't even fit it all on the screen. But it's somewhere around here. It was something like 30 centimeters. So length of my V-neck is 30 centimeters. And again, we've got those numbers from our very first step here. But this time, because we're finally talking about a length that we want, we can talk about our row gauge. So what I've got is 4 stitches per centimeter, or rather that's 4 rows per centimeter. 30 times 4 is equal to 120 rows. So I want to evenly disperse these increases over the next 120 rows. But then my next question is, okay, how many increases are we actually doing here? And the answer is that we want the front panel, once we've got the whole thing, to be the same width as the back panel. So if I go back to the back panel for a second, we can get a good visual of this. Okay, so remember that on the back, we had this initial number of stitches cast on, and then we increased by this amount of stitches, and then picked those ones up for the fronts. So basically these stitches are accounted for me, that's 5 cables. But this number of stitches, the ones that actually here to here, the ones that we cast on in the first place for the back of the neck, those are the ones that we still need to increase to account for on that neckline. For me, that was 63 stitches. We do want to evenly divide that over the 2 fronts, of course. And then also for me, I am not joining in the front, so I need to account for a button band as well. So this is where I have to decide how wide I want that button band to be. I'm just going with the width of one of my cables, which for me is 7 stitches. So what I want here is 63 stitches that I need to account for, minus the 7 that I will use for the button band, divided by 2 to account for the left front and the right front. And that gives me 28 stitches that need to be added on either side. So 28 increases, evenly divided over about 120 rows. Now, the chances that your number here, 28, will fit perfectly into the number here, pretty low. So you are going to have to either round up or round down here. But I think ideally what I'm going to do is increase every 4th row, and 28 times 4 gives me 112 rows. So that's telling me that if I increase 28 times once every 4th row, that will go on for 112 rows, which is pretty close to my desired 120. So that alone gives us the shaping that we need along here. And then at a certain point, you are going to have kind of 2 things going on at once, if your V-neck is as deep as mine is. Because once you get here, you are going to want to make sure that you are adding the same stitches that you did on the back panel for the front panel for the underarms. So again, for me, I wanted to add 60 in total, so I decided to add 20 on the back panel, 20 on the front panel, and then I'll add another 20 when I am joining the fronts and the backs, just by doing a backwards loop cast on. And by the way, I haven't really talked about here where to do the increases themselves. That's because you can really decide that for yourself. So for example, here on the V-neck, I was doing my increases right on the other side of the edge stitch here. But then when I did my increases for the back panel, I was increasing on this side of this cable. I'll actually show you an example of this on a different self-drafted object. So this is again the same construction on this self-drafted sweater. This is cast on stitches here, trapezoid shape here, and then you can see where I was doing my increases, which is on the side of this cable, rather than doing it on the edge stitch, which would have been here. And that's what gives you that nice shape where you've got a cable, or maybe you just want to do a few like stockinette stitches, framing that shoulder shaping. Okay, and those instructions so far get us to the point where we've got the back panel and the two front panels. If you were doing some kind of slip over, you would also be able to join the two front panels. And then the joining of the fronts and the back, we don't really need any more steps than we already have, because we already figured out from this math here how many stitches we want to add at the underarm when we are doing that joining row. So the rest of this becomes pretty much intuitive, where you join the fronts and the backs and then keep knitting in pattern until you get to your desired length. You do whatever ribbing you want at the bottom, and then you're good. So as you can see, that is the step that I am at right now with my work in progress here. So I do still have a bit of work to do, and I figured that we could figure it out together. The next thing that I need to do is the ribbing along the armholes here. Now, a general rule when you are picking up stitches for a neckband or an armhole, if you're going to do ribbing, or if you were even doing a sleeve, if you wanted to use these instructions to make a sweater, when you have cast on stitches, so when I say cast on stitches, I mean like what we did for the back neckline, or what we did for the underarms when we were joining the front and the back. For those stitches, you want to pick up every single stitch. So for me, that was 20 stitches under the arm. But then the question is what we do for the rest of this. And I am sure that we have all been burned in the past when doing patterns where the pattern specifies a pickup rate, we do it, and we are nowhere close to how many stitches we should have. And usually it's because our row gauge is off, even if we think it's not by that much. Okay, so what I'm gonna do here is take my stitch gauge and divide it by my row gauge. So that for me is 35 divided by 40. And then I am going to reduce that fraction as much as I can. So this is actually, these are very nice numbers for me. I'm quite lucky. This ends up being 7/8. So what that means is 7 stitches for every 8. And the reason that this ratio works, the stitch gauge divided by the row gauge, is that along here we've got our rows, our row gauge. But then when we go to pick up the stitches, I've just got my swatch here, we'll be knitting in this direction. So that change in direction means that we've got the row gauge compared to the stitch gauge going this way. So one divided by the other gives us the answer that we need. So this kind of becomes my answer. I'm going to pick up every stitch on the underarm, but then for the rest of this, I'm going to do 7 stitches for every 8 stitches. And then finally, this is the part I've been dreading. Let's talk about the button band. Now, for a regular ribbed button band, same general rule applies as here, where for the back of the neck, you want to pick up every single stitch for the cast-on stitches, and then for the rest of it, we're then talking about row gauge, so you want to do the ratio situation. Now, I, for some reason, have decided I want to try a double knit button band here on this fingering weight vest. Now, don't laugh, but I'm about to show you the smallest swatch in the world. There's no way that I was going to do a 10 centimeter swatch of this double knitting. I basically just wanted to see here if the needle size would be appropriate for double knitting, and it seems to be. And The other thing is that this gives me a gauge, a row gauge for my double knitting, and I'm gonna go ahead and calculate that now. Ideally, yes, I would have done 10 centimeters, but I wasn't gonna do that. So what I have here is 12 rows is equal to 3 centimeters. Or we could also say that this is 4 rows per centimeter. And what I want to do now is compare that to the row gauge that we calculated at the very first step, which was actually the same, 4 rows per centimeter and 4 rows per centimeter. What that tells me is that if I pick up every stitch along here and then do double knitting, it should be good. Now, if I had ended up with a different row gauge between the double knitting and the pattern itself, I would have wanted to do a similar ratio to what I did here, where I divide the double knitting row gauge to the pattern row gauge. Okay, so that gives me my final step. I now need to go do a lot of ribbing and also a fingering weight double knit button band. So for me, that's going to take several weeks, but for you, I can snap my fingers and you will see the finished product.